The New Mexico Territory, 1877, a land where justice was scarce and mercy scarcer still. When a Mescalero Apache woman named Nahimana is captured by ruthless bounty hunters seeking blood money, her fate seems sealed. But sometimes heroes emerge from the most unlikely places. This is the story of how one man, a lone settler with nothing left to lose, defied an entire territory to do what was right, even if it meant becoming the very outlaw he once despised. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Nahimana moved through the juniper grove with practiced silence, her fingers carefully selecting the ripest berries that glistened in the early morning light. The sacred mountains of her people rose behind her, their peaks catching the first golden rays of dawn. She hummed softly, a melody taught by her grandmother, as her nimble hands worked with swift precision. The Mescalero Apache had called these mountains home for generations, long before the treaties were broken, long before the bounties were placed on their heads. The thought flickered across her mind like a shadow, but she pushed it away. Today was for gathering, for medicine, for life. Nahimana's basket grew heavy with juniper berries, wild herbs, and the precious yellow pollen she had carefully collected from the flowering plants that dotted the foothills. Her people needed these medicines now more than ever, with winter approaching and sickness already creeping through the settlement. Being the daughter of the tribe's medicine woman meant responsibilities that stretched beyond her 22 years, but she carried them with quiet dignity. A hawk circles overhead, its cry piercing the morning stillness. Nahimana paused, watching, its graceful arc against the endless blue sky. Her father had always said the hawk was her spirit guardian, watchful, patient, fierce when necessary. She smiled at the memory of him. You shouldn't wander this far alone. The voice startled her, though she didn't show it. Turning, she found Kitchi leaning against a weathered pine, his Winchester rifle resting casually across his shoulders. Though only 4 years her senior, responsibility had etched premature lines around his eyes, making him look older than his 26 years. The soldiers rarely patrol this far into the mountains, she replied, resuming her gathering. And I'm hardly alone with you, shadowing me like a mountain lion. Kitchi's mouth twitched with the ghost of a smile. It's not just soldiers we need to worry about these days, she knew what he meant. Bounty hunters, men who hunted Apaches for the rewards offered by territorial officials. $40 for a man's scalp, 20 for a woman's, 10 for a child's. The thought made her stomach turn. Did the council send you to watch over me? She asked, though she already knew the answer. No, Kitchi admitted, pushing away from the tree to approach her. Your mother did. Nahimana smiled despite herself. Her mother, ever protective, even of a daughter who had proven herself capable of surviving the harshest conditions their homeland could offer. Then you've wasted a morning that could have been spent hunting, she teased, passing him her basket, as she climbed onto a rocky outcropping to reach a cluster of rare flowers that grew there. Any morning spent with you is never wasted, Kitchi replied, his voice carrying a warmth reserved only for her. They had known each other since childhood, had grown up side by side as their people moved between summer and winter grounds, had learned to hunt and track and survive together. And somewhere along that journey, friendship had blossomed into something deeper, something neither had yet put into words, but both understood. Kitchi watched her work, admiring the grace with which she moved, the knowledge in her fingers as they selected plants that to his eye looked identical to the ones she passed over. The elders are meeting tonight, he said after a comfortable silence. They say Mason's Creek settlement is growing again. More farmers, more cattle. Nahimana nodded, her expression growing solemn. Less land for us. Chief Nata'ani wants to send a delegation to remind them of the boundaries in the treaty. She descended from the rocks, landing lightly beside him. Treaties mean nothing to them, Kitchi. You know this. What would you have us do? Fight? We've seen how that ends. His jaw tightened, memories of battles lost, of friends and family who would never return. Nahimana placed a gentle hand on his arm. There must be a middle path, one that doesn't end in bloodshed. Kitchi covered her hand with his own, their eyes meeting in silent understanding. This was the world they had inherited, a world of shrinking territories and growing threats, where survival meant walking an impossible line between resistance and accommodation. "Come," she said softly, retrieving her basket. "We should return before midday. The council will want these medicines." They walked in companionable silence, following a path invisible to untrained eyes. The forest embraced them, sheltering them, beneath ancient pines that had witnessed centuries of human struggle come and go like passing seasons. As they created a ridge overlooking the valley where their small settlement lay nestled against the mountainside, Kitchi suddenly tensed. He raised a hand, signaling Nahimana to stop. "What is it?" she whispered, instantly alert. He pointed to a thin column of smoke rising from the wrong direction, not from their settlement's cooking fires, but from the eastern approach, where a little-used trail wound through the foothills. "Travelers," Kitchi murmured, his hand moving instinctively to his rifle. "Or hunters," Nahimana added, her voice calm despite the flutter of apprehension in her chest. "Stay here," Kitchi instructed, already moving toward a vantage point that would give him a better view. But Nahimana followed, setting down her basket carefully behind a boulder. "Two sets of eyes are better than one," she reminded him. Together, they crept forward, using the terrain for cover until they reached a rocky outcropping overlooking the narrow trail below. What they saw made Nahimana's blood run cold. 5 men on horseback, heavily armed, their faces weathered by sun and hardened by greed. 2 led pack mules loaded with supplies, but it was what hung from one of the mules that caused Kitchi to grip his rifle until his knuckles turned white. Scalps, at least a dozen, dried and tied to the saddlebags like macabre trophies. Bounty hunters. Nahimana felt Kitchi's muscles coil beside her, saw the cold rage in his eyes as he raised his rifle. "No," she whispered urgently, placing her hand on the barrel. "There are too many, and they would only send more." Reluctantly, Kitchi lowered his weapon. "We need to warn the others," he said, his voice a harsh whisper. "They can't be allowed near our people." Nahimana nodded, already calculating the fastest route back to the settlement. They needed to move quickly to evacuate the most vulnerable, to hide the children and elders in the caves higher up the mountain where they had sheltered before. As they retreated, a branch snapped beneath Kitchi's foot, a sound that seemed to echo through the forest like a gunshot. Below, the bounty hunters halted, hands moving to weapons. "Run!" Kitchi ordered, pushing Nahimana ahead of him. "Don't stop, don't look back." And so they ran, racing against time and the growing certainty that their peaceful morning had just become a desperate fight for survival. The forest seemed to hold its breath as Nahimana and Kitchi raced through familiar terrain, now transformed by urgency. They moved like shadows, their footfalls barely disturbing the pine needles carpeting the ground. Behind them, shouts echoed. The bounty hunters had detected their presence and were giving chase. "We need to split up," Kitchi said, his voice low and tense as they paused behind a massive boulder. "I'll lead them away from the settlement." Nahimana grabbed his arm. "That's suicide, Kitchi." "Our people need warning," he insisted. "You're faster than me. Get to them. Tell them to move. To the high caves." His eyes held hers, filled with a fierce determination that brooked no argument. "I'll circle back and meet you there by nightfall." The wisdom in his plan was undeniable, but fear clutched at Nahimana's heart. "Promise me," she whispered. "By the breath of our ancestors," he replied, the most sacred oath their people knew. With one last look, they parted, Nahimana heading west toward their settlement, while Kitchi turned south, making deliberate noise to draw attention. The sound of pursuit followed Kitchi, just as he'd intended. Nahimana pressed forward, her lungs burning as she pushed herself harder, faster. The medicine basket was long abandoned, her only thought now the safety of her people. The wind changed suddenly, carrying with it a scent that made her freeze mid-stride. Smoke. Not the clean smoke of cooking fires, but the acrid, heavy smoke of destruction. An orange glow flickered through the trees ahead. Her heart sank as realization dawned. The bounty hunters below weren't the only ones. This had been a coordinated attack. Nahimana crouched low, approaching with extreme caution. From the cover of a juniper thicket, she beheld a scene from her worst nightmares. Their settlement was in flames. Bounty hunters, at least 8 of them, moved through the burning structures, weapons drawn. Some of her people lay motionless on the ground. Others were being bound, forced into a line like cattle. Her mother was among them, standing proudly despite the blood running down her temple. The sight sent rage coursing through Nahimana's veins, hot and potent. Her hand moved to the knife at her waist, fingers curling around the bone handle. But she forced herself to think beyond emotion. 8 armed men against 1 woman with a knife. She would die before helping anyone. A flicker of movement to her left caught her attention. Children being led away by 2 elders through a hidden path. At least some had escaped. She needed to find Kitchi. Together they could follow, protect those who had fled, perhaps even free the captives once they were on the trail. As she prepared to retreat, a rough hand clamped over her mouth, another seizing her arm in an iron grip. She fought instinctively, twisting, kicking, trying to reach her knife. "Easy," a voice hissed in her ear. "I ain't with them." The accent was American, the English choppy but understandable. Nahimana stilled, not out of compliance but strategic. Pause. The man holding her wasn't one of the bounty hunters she'd seen below. He released her mouth but maintained his grip on her arm. "They're planning to hit every Apache camp in these mountains," he whispered. "This is just the start." Nahimana turned enough to see him. A white man in his 30s, bearded, dressed in worn trail clothes. His eyes were hard but not cruel. "Why tell me this?" she demanded in English, her accent shaped by the missionary school she'd been forced to attend as a child. "Because I ain't in the business of killing women and children," he replied. "Name's Thorne, Mason Thorne." The name was vaguely familiar, though she couldn't place it. "Let go of me," she commanded. Surprisingly, he complied, though he remained tense, ready to grab her again if she tried to flee. "You got a band of bounty hunters between you and your people. You rush down there, you'll end up dead or worse." "Those are my people," she said, voice tight with controlled fury. "My family." Mason nodded toward the distant figures being led away. "They're taking them to Fort Stanton. Military's paying extra for live captures, testing some new reservation program." The contempt in his voice when he spoke of the program was unmistakable. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Why should I believe you?" Nahimana asked, though the scene below confirmed much of what he said. "Because I just deserted my post at that time 3 days ago," he answered grimly. "Couldn't stomach what was happening there." Before Nahimana could respond, gunshots cracked through the air from the south, where Kitchi had gone. Her head whipped around, heart seizing. "Your friend?" Mason asked, following her gaze. She didn't answer, already moving in that direction. Mason caught her arm again. "That's exactly what they want, to draw out anyone who escaped the initial raid." "Let go," she hissed, struggling against his grip. "Listen to me," he insisted, his voice urgent but low. "There's another band of hunters between here and there. You rush in, you'll be walking right into their trap." Nahimana stilled, studying his face for deception. Finding none, she asked, "How do you know this?" "Because I've been tracking these bastards for 2 days," he replied. They're organized. 3 groups working together. 1 to attack the settlement, 1 to cut off escape routes south, 1 to sweep from the east. They've got the whole area surrounded. The tactical assessment rang true, matching the precision of the attack. It wasn't the chaotic violence of opportunistic bounty hunters, but something more calculated. Who leads them? She asked. Man named Silas Blackwood, used to be in the army. Now he makes his living collecting Apache scalps and captives. Mason spat on the ground. He's got friends in high places and no conscience to speak of. The sound of horses approaching from below made them both drop lower into the brush. A group of 4 bounty hunters rode past their hiding place, heading in the direction of the gunshots. We need to move, Mason whispered. They're sweeping the area. I'm not leaving without knowing what happened to Kitchi, Nahimana insisted. Mason studied her with frustration and something like respect. There's a ridge half a mile east, gives a view of the whole southern approach. We can see what's happening without exposing ourselves. It was a reasonable compromise. Nahimana nodded curtly, and they began moving through the underbrush with a practiced stealth. As they traveled, questions burned in her mind. Why would a white settler risk himself to warn Apaches? What had he seen at Fort Stanton that drove him to the desert? And could she trust him, or was this simply a more elaborate trap? The ridge Mason spoke of was a narrow outcropping of red stone overlooking a small valley. They lay flat, peering over the edge. Below, a group of bounty hunters had gathered. In their midst knelt 3 Apache men, hands bound behind their backs. Nahimana's breath caught. One was Kitchi. Blood matted his hair, but he was alive, his posture defiant despite his capture. "Your man?" Mason asked quietly. She nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. Mason studied the scene with narrowed eyes. "That's Blackwood," he said, indicating a tall figure on horseback. The man's long coat was adorned with what looked like military insignia, though not in any official configuration. "He likes to interrogate his captives personally. They think they know where the larger bands are hiding." "And then he kills them?" Nahimana asked, though she already knew the answer. "Sometimes," Mason replied grimly. "Sometimes he does worse." They watched as Blackwood dismounted, approaching the kneeling men. Though too distant to hear words, the menace in his posture was unmistakable. "We have to help them," Nahimana said, her hand again finding her knife. Mason caught her wrist. "There are 11 armed men down there. We'd be dead before we got within 20 yards. So we do nothing," she challenged me. "No," he replied, his voice hardening with resolve. "We follow, we wait, and when the moment is right, we act." Nahimana looked from Mason to the scene below, where Kitchi now endured a backhanded blow from Blackwood. Every instinct screamed for immediate action, but logic told her Mason was right. "Why help us?" she asked, studying his weathered face. Something dark passed behind his eyes. "Let's just say I've got a debt that needs paying." He shifted, preparing to retreat from the ridge. "They'll be moving out soon, taking your people to the fort. We need to get ahead of them, find a place to plan." As they backed away from the ridge, the sound of Blackwood's laughter drifted up from below, cold, confident, cruel. A sound that promised pain. Nahimana cast one last look at Kitchi's distant figure before following Mason into the forest. "One way or another," she vowed silently, this man Blackwood would pay for what he'd done that day. And she would free her people or die in the attempt. Twilight painted the mountains in hues of amber and purple as Nahimana and Mason made their way through the forest. They moved in tense silence, each step taking them further from the captured Apaches, but closer to whatever plan Mason was formulating. "There's an abandoned trapper's cabin about 2 miles ahead," Mason said finally, his voice barely audible above the chirping of evening crickets. "We can rest there, plan our next move." Nahimana studied his profile in the fading light. "You know these mountains well for a fort soldier." A shadow crossed his face. I wasn't always a soldier." Before she could press further, Mason raised his hand in warning. They froze, listening. The distant sound of hoofbeats echoed through the canyon to their right. "They're moving faster than I expected," Mason muttered. Nahimana crouched, peering through the brush toward the narrow trail below. "Is it Blackwood?" "No," Mason replied, joining her. "Advance party, probably scouting the route ahead." Through gaps in the foliage, they watched as 3 riders appeared, moving at a cautious trot. Unlike the bounty hunters they'd seen earlier, these men wore fragments of military uniform mixed with civilian clothes, deserters perhaps, or former soldiers turned mercenaries. "We should take them," Nahimana whispered, her hand moving to her knife. Mason gave her an incredulous look. 3 armed men? That's your plan?" "We need their horses if we're going to catch up to my people," she replied coolly. "And their weapons." Mason hesitated, weighing the risk. Finally he nodded. "All right, but we do this smart." He pointed to a bend in the trail ahead, where it narrowed between 2 large boulders. "Can you get there before they do?" Nahimana was already moving, silent as a shadow across the forest floor. Mason circled in the opposite direction, positioning himself above the trail. Their timing would need to be perfect. Nahimana reached the narrow passage and quickly gathered fallen branches, arranging them across the path. Not enough to immediately alert the riders, but sufficient to make the horses hesitate at a crucial moment. Then she melted into the darkness of a nearby juniper, waiting. The riders approached, their conversation carrying clearly in the still evening air. "A Blackwood wants them at the fort by tomorrow night," one was saying, a tall man with a pockmarked face. "Why the rush?" asked another, younger with a nervous energy about him. "Army patrols due back in 3 days," replied the first. "Blackwood wants everything squared away before the captain returns. Less questions that way." "Still don't see why we couldn't just take their scalps and be done," grumbled the third, a heavy-set man with a thick beard. "Live captives are nothing but trouble. Because the army pays triple for live ones they can ship east," the first explained, with exaggerated patience. "Blackwood's got a deal with the Indian Affairs Office. Something about a cultural integration program," the youngest snorted. "Is that what they're calling it now?" They fell silent as they approached the narrow passage. Just as the lead horse reached the scattered branches, it balked, snorting nervously. "What the—" the leader began. Mason's shot cracked through the silence, catching the heavy-set rider in the shoulder. He cried out, tumbling from his saddle as his horse reared in panic. In the same instant, Nahimana launched herself from hiding, tackling the youngest rider from his mount. They hit the ground hard, the wind knocked from the young man's lungs. Nahimana drove her knee into his sternum, pressing her blade against his throat before he could recover. The leader wheeled his horse around, drawing his pistol, but Mason had already emerged from the rocks above, rifle aimed steadily. "Drop it," Mason commanded. The man hesitated, eyes darting between his fallen companions and Mason's unwavering aim. Finally, he let the pistol fall to the dirt. "Get down," Mason ordered. "Slow." As the leader dismounted, the wounded man groaned, clutching his bleeding shoulder. "You've made a mistake," he spat through gritted teeth. "When Blackwood finds out—" "He won't," Nahimana interrupted, rising from the subdued young rider. "Not until it's too late." Within minutes, they had bound the 3 men with their own ropes and gagged them with strips of cloth. Mason examined their weapons, 2 pistols, a rifle and several knives, while Nahimana calmed the nervous horses. "What about them?" she asked, gesturing to the captives. Mason considered. "We can't risk them alerting Blackwood." The wounded man's eyes widened with fear. "We're not killers," Nahimana said firmly, reading Mason's expression. "Not like them." After a moment, Mason nodded. "There's a mining shaft about half a mile east, abandoned years ago. We'll leave them there, deep enough that their shouts won't carry, but they'll be found eventually." It took nearly an hour to secure the bounty hunters in the old shaft, using a fallen tree trunk to block the narrow entrance. When they returned to the horses, night had fully descended, the mountains silhouetted against a star-filled sky. "You handle a blade well," Mason observed as they mounted, a note of respect in his voice. "And you shoot straight for a deserter," she replied, adjusting herself on the saddle. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Former deserter, now I'm just a fool with a death wish, apparently." They rode in silence for a time, following a game trail that paralleled the main route. The horses moved easily beneath them, sensing the urgency of their riders. "Tell me about this Fort Stanton," Nahimana said finally. "What awaits my people there?" Mason's expression hardened. "Nothing good. The fort commander, Colonel Walton, has special arrangements with bounty hunters like Blackwood. Official policy is to relocate Apaches to reservations, but Walton's been funneling captives to railroad companies and mining operations that need labor." "Slavery," Nahimana said flatly. "They call it rehabilitation through industry." Mason replied, disgust evident in his voice. "Men are sent to the mines, women and children to camps where they're taught civilized ways, meaning they break their spirit, force them to forget their language, their customs. And the military allows this." Mason's laugh was bitter. "The military profits from it. Colonel Walton gets a percentage of every Apache he processes through the system." "And you were part of this," Nahimana stated. Not a question, but an accusation. Mason was silent for several long moments. "I was stationed at Fort Stanton 3 months ago," he finally said. "Transferred from Fort Union. At first, I didn't understand what was happening. By the time I did," he trailed off. "What changed?" she pressed. "2 weeks ago, they brought in a group of Mescalero, a family." His knuckles whitened on the reins. "The youngest was a girl, couldn't have been more than 5. She was sick, fever, coughing. Instead of treating her, Walton ordered her separated from her mother, said she'd contaminate the batch." Nahimana's stomach clenched, already anticipating the end of this story. "I tried to help her. Smuggled medicine from the infirmary, but it was too late." Mason's voice had dropped to barely a whisper. "When she died, they didn't even bury her properly. Just threw her in a pit with the others who hadn't survived the journey. So you deserted." "Not before I put a bullet in the quartermaster who denied her medicine," Mason admitted. "He lived, unfortunately. But it was enough to earn me a hanging if they catch me." The pieces fell into place for Nahimana. "That's why you're helping us. Redemption." Mason met her gaze, his eyes reflecting starlight. "Call it what you want. I call it doing what a man should have done from the start." Before Nahimana could respond, the night erupted with violence. A shot whistled past her ear, followed by the thunderous report of a rifle. Her horse reared, nearly throwing her. "Ambush!" Mason shouted, drawing his pistol. Dark figures emerged from the trees ahead, at least 5 of them. More shots rang out, one grazing Mason's arm. He fired back, his bullet finding a target who fell with a guttural cry. "This way!" Nahimana yelled, spotting a ravine to their left. She dug her heels into her horse's flanks, urging it forward. They crashed through the underbrush, bullets splintering bark around them. One of the pursuing riders appeared in front of them, blocking their path. Without hesitation, Nahimana lowered her body against her horse's neck and charged directly at him. The man's eyes widened in shock at her audacity. He fired wildly, missing before her horse slammed into his. Both animals screamed, but Nahimana's larger mount knocked the other side. As they passed, she lashed out with her knife, feeling it bite into flesh. They plunged down the ravine, stones and dirt cascading beneath the horses' hooves. Behind them, shouts and curses faded as distance and darkness swallowed them. When they finally slowed, both breathing hard, Mason examined his bleeding arm. "Just a graze," he muttered. "You?" "He won't," Nahimana interrupted, rising from the subdued young rider. "Not until it's too late." Within minutes, they had bound the 3 men with their own ropes and gagged them with strips of cloth. Mason examined their weapons, 2 pistols, a rifle and several knives, while Nahimana calmed the nervous horses. "What about them?" she asked, gesturing to the captives. Mason considered. "We can't risk them alerting Blackwood." The wounded man's eyes widened with fear. "We're not killers," Nahimana said firmly, reading Mason's expression. "Not like them." After a moment, Mason nodded. "There's a mining shaft about half a mile east, abandoned years ago. We'll leave them there, deep enough that their shouts won't carry, but they'll be found eventually." It took nearly an hour to secure the bounty hunters in the old shaft, using a fallen tree trunk to block the narrow entrance. When they returned, to the horses, night had fully descended, the mountains silhouetted against a star-filled sky. "You handle a blade well," Mason observed as they mounted, a note of respect in his voice. "And you shoot straight for a deserter," she replied, adjusting herself on the saddle. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Former deserter, now I'm just a fool with a death wish, apparently." They rode in silence for a time, following a game trail that paralleled the main route. The horses moved easily beneath them, sensing the urgency of their riders. "Tell me about this Fort Stanton," Nahimana said finally. "What awaits my people there?" Mason's expression hardened. "Nothing good. The fort commander, Colonel Walton, has special arrangements with bounty hunters like Blackwood. Official policy is to relocate Apaches to reservations, but Walton's been funneling captives to railroad companies and mining operations that need labor." "Slavery," Nahimana said flatly. "They call it rehabilitation through industry." Mason replied, disgust evident in his voice. "Men are sent to the mines, women and children to camps where they're taught civilized ways, meaning they break their spirit, force them to forget their language, their customs. And the military allows this." Mason's laugh was bitter. "The military profits from it. Colonel Walton gets a percentage of every Apache he processes through the system." "And you were part of this," Nahimana stated. Not a question, but an accusation. Mason was silent for several long moments. "I was stationed at Fort Stanton 3 months ago," he finally said. "Transferred from Fort Union. At first, I didn't understand what was happening. By the time I did," he trailed off. "What changed?" she pressed. "2 weeks ago, they brought in a group of Mescalero, a family." His knuckles whitened on the reins. "The youngest was a girl, couldn't have been more than 5. She was sick, fever, coughing. Instead of treating her, Walton ordered her separated from her mother, said she'd contaminate the batch." Nahimana's stomach clenched, already anticipating the end of this story. "I tried to help her. Smuggled medicine from the infirmary, but it was too late." Mason's voice had dropped to barely a whisper. "When she died, they didn't even bury her properly. Just threw her in a pit with the others who hadn't survived the journey. So you deserted." "Not before I put a bullet in the quartermaster who denied her medicine," Mason admitted. "He lived, unfortunately. But it was enough to earn me a hanging if they catch me. The pieces fell into place for Nahimana. That's why you're helping us. Redemption." Mason met her gaze, his eyes reflecting starlight. "Call it what you want. I call it doing what a man should have done from the start." Before Nahimana could respond, the night erupted with violence. A shot whistled past her ear, followed by the thunderous report of a rifle. Her horse reared, nearly throwing her. "Ambush!" Mason shouted, drawing his pistol. Dark figures emerged from the trees ahead, at least 5 of them. More shots rang out, one grazing Mason's arm. He fired back, his bullet finding a target who fell with a guttural cry. "This way!" Nahimana yelled, spotting a ravine to their left. She dug her heels into her horse's flanks, urging it forward. They crashed through the underbrush, bullets splintering bark around them. One of the pursuing riders appeared in front of them, blocking their path. Without hesitation, Nahimana lowered her body against her horse's neck and charged directly at him. The man's eyes widened in shock at her audacity. He fired wildly, missing before her horse slammed into his. Both animals screamed, but Nahimana's larger mount knocked the other side. As they passed, she lashed out with her knife, feeling it bite into flesh. They plunged down the ravine, stones and dirt cascading beneath the horses' hooves. Behind them, shouts and curses faded as distance and darkness swallowed them. When they finally slowed, both breathing hard, Mason examined his bleeding arm. "Just a graze," he muttered. "You? The colonel understands the difficulties of your operation," Mason replied, his voice carrying the clipped tones of military speech. "His primary concern is that the merchandise arrives intact." Blackwood laughed, a sound like stones grinding together. "They're hardy stock, Apache women especially. They fetch double on the private market, but Walton insists on the first claim." Nahimana's fingers tightened around her knife at the casual cruelty of his words. She watched as Mason walked toward the wagons, ostensibly inspecting the merchandise. As he passed the second wagon containing the male captives, something subtle passed between him and Kitchi. A glance, nothing more. But Nahimana saw Kitchi's posture shift slightly. Her attention snapped back to Blackwood as he approached one of his lieutenants, speaking in lower tones that she strained to hear. "Still don't trust him," the lieutenant was saying. "Walton usually sends Mitchell or Benson. I know every man in Walton's command," Blackwood replied dismissively. "Never seen this one before." "That's my point, sir." Blackwood studied Mason's back thoughtfully. "Send a rider ahead to the fort. Have them verify this escort was expected." Nahimana's blood ran cold. Mason's deception would unravel the moment that rider reached the fort. She needed to warn him, but any movement now would expose her position. She watched helplessly as a rider departed at a gallop, heading northeast toward Fort Stanton. Mason, unaware of this development, continued his inspection of the wagons, occasionally exchanging words with Blackwood that seemed to ease the bounty hunter's suspicions. The caravan resumed its journey an hour later, moving deeper into the pass. Nahimana followed, anxiety building with each passing minute. Mason had yet to make his move, and time was running out. As the trail curved around a sharp bend, Mason dropped back slightly from Blackwood's side, his hand moving to his holster. Nahimana tensed, recognizing the telltale signs of a man preparing to act. But before he could draw his weapon, a rider approached from the opposite direction, the same scout who had been sent ahead, returning far too quickly. Nahimana's stomach dropped. Something had gone terribly wrong. The rider pulled alongside Blackwood, speaking urgently into his ear. Blackwood's head snapped toward Mason, his expression transforming from suspicion to murderous rage in an instant. "Imposter!" Blackwood roared, drawing his pistol. Mason reacted with lightning speed, spurring his horse forward while drawing his own weapon. His first shot caught Blackwood's lieutenant in the chest, sending him tumbling from his saddle. His second went wide as Blackwood's men returned fire. Chaos erupted. The wagons halted abruptly, horses rearing in panic. Mason galloped toward the second wagon, firing at the guards as he approached. For a moment, it seemed he might reach the captives. Then Blackwood's bullet found its mark. Mason jerked in the saddle, blood blossoming across his shoulder. A second shot followed, striking his horse. The animal collapsed, sending Mason crashing to the ground. Nahimana watched in horror as bounty hunters surrounded him. Despite his wound, Mason fought like a cornered wolf, taking down 2 more men before a rifle butt to the head finally subdued him. Blackwood dismounted, approaching the fallen man with deliberate slowness. He kicked Mason onto his back, pressing, a boot against his wounded shoulder. Even from her distant position, Nahimana could hear Mason's grunt of pain. "Well, well," Blackwood drawled, loud enough for all to hear. "A deserter playing hero, Mason Thorne himself." He pressed harder, eliciting another pained sound. "Colonel Walton's had a price on your head for weeks. Seems Christmas has come early." Nahimana's mind raced. They knew him by name, which meant his crimes at the fort were known as well. There would be no mercy. She watched as they bound Mason's hands and threw him into the wagon with the male captives. Kitchi shifted to make room for him, their eyes meeting briefly. An understanding seemed to pass between them, two warriors, different in every way, now united in captivity. Blackwood mounted his horse, gesturing for the caravan to continue. "Double the guards," he ordered. "Our deserter friend wasn't working." Alone, find his accomplice. Scouts fanned out, beginning to search the surrounding ridges. Nahimana pressed herself deeper into the shadows of her hiding place, as one passed barely 20 feet from her position. When the scout moved on, she remained motionless, processing this devastating shift in their fortunes. Mason was captured. The element of surprise was lost, and now the bounty hunters knew to look for her. Yet as the wagons rumbled away, carrying both her people and the man who had risked everything to help them, Nahimana felt something hardened within her. Not despair, but resolve. She was alone now, a single Apache woman against an army of killers. The odds were impossible, but impossible odds were all her people had ever known. As darkness fell, Nahimana gathered her meager weapons, a knife, a pistol with 6 bullets, and the fierce determination that had kept the Mescalero Apache alive for generations, despite everything the white world had thrown against them. Tonight she would follow. Tomorrow she will act, and Blackwood would learn that he had not captured all of his enemies after all. Night enveloped the mountains, bringing with it a bitter chill that cut through Nahimana's clothing as she tracked the caravan. The bounty hunters had made camp in a clearing surrounded by pines, their fires casting eerie shadows across the forest floor. She lay on her stomach atop a ridge overlooking their position, counting guards and studying their patterns. 8 men patrolled, the perimeter rotating every 2 hours. The captives were kept in the wagons, now reinforced with chains. Mason and Kitchi had been separated from the others, tied to a post near Blackwood's tent, an arrangement that spoke volumes about how dangerous the bounty hunter considered them. Nahimana's body ached from the day's exertions, her muscles stiff from hours of crawling through underbrush to avoid detection, but physical discomfort was the least of her concerns. The impossible math of her situation pressed down upon her. 1 woman against 20 armed men. A direct assault was suicide. Stealth offered little hope when the captives were so heavily guarded. And with each passing hour, Fort Stanton grew closer, along with the point of no return for her people. As she watched, Blackwood emerged from his tent and approached the post where Mason and Kitchi were bound. The bounty hunter's voice carried. On the night air, 2 warriors, he mused, crouching before them. 1 Apache, 1 white renegade, both fools. He drew a knife, examining its edge in the firelight. "Tell me about the woman who rode with you, deserter." Mason's response was too low to hear, but Blackwood's reaction, a sudden backhand across Mason's face, made its defiance clear. "I can make your journey very uncomfortable," Blackwood continued, his voice hardening, "or I can end it here, your choice." Even from her distant vantage point, Nahimana could see the blood trickling from Mason's mouth as he straightened. Whatever he said next made Blackwood laugh coldly before moving on to Kitchi. Kitchi's response to Blackwood's questions was silence, complete and resolute. The bounty hunter tested his knife against Kitchi's cheek, drawing a thin line of blood. But the Apache warrior's expression never changed. Frustration evident, Blackwood finally stalked back to his tent, barking orders at the guards to keep extra watch on the prisoners. Nahimana retreated from her observation point, moving silently through the forest until she reached a small hollow where the remaining horse waited, tethered to a stunted pine. The animal nickered softly as she approached. She needed rest, but more importantly, she needed a plan. Exhaustion clouded her thinking, making the impossible seem even more so. Settling beneath a rocky overhang, she forced herself to eat a handful of dried berries from her pouch, her only sustenance since the previous day. As she chewed methodically, her fingers traced the contours of her mother's medicine pouch, which she had worn around her neck since childhood. Within it lay sacred herbs, tiny bones for divination, and a small obsidian arrowhead that had belonged to her grandfather, items of power in her people's tradition. Her mother had taught her that when the path ahead seemed darkest, one must quiet the mind and listen to the ancestors. Closing her eyes, Nahimana breathed deeply, centering herself as she had been taught. The solution, when it came, was not from ancestral wisdom, but practical experience. Her people had survived for generations, not by winning direct confrontations with superior forces, but by turning the land itself into a weapon. Eyes snapping open, Nahimana surveyed her surroundings with renewed purpose. Tomorrow, the caravan would need to cross White Rock Canyon, a treacherous passage with steep walls and a narrow trail that wound along a precipitous drop. It was a natural bottleneck and therefore an opportunity. She would not attempt to free all the captives at once. Such an endeavor was doomed to failure. Instead, she would focus on freeing Mason and Kitchi. 3 warriors together stood a better chance than one alone. With this clarity of purpose, she allowed herself a few hours of fitful sleep, knife in hand, senses alert to the slightest disturbance. Before dawn broke, she was moving again, pushing, ahead of the caravan's path to reach White Rock Canyon. The morning sun had barely crested the mountains when she arrived at the canyon's narrowest point. Here, the trail hugged the cliff face, with a sheer drop of nearly 100 feet on the outer edge. Directly above, the canyon wall rose another, 60 feet, dotted with precariously balanced boulders, the remnants of ancient rock slides. Nahimana climbed swiftly, fingers finding holes in the weathered stone, her body moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had known these mountains since childhood. Near the top, she found what she sought, a cluster of large rocks that seemed to defy gravity, held in place by little more than time and stubborn resistance to the pull of the earth. Working quickly, she began to dig away at the soil and smaller stones that supported the largest boulder, careful not to trigger a premature collapse. It was painstaking work, requiring both strength and delicacy. One miscalculation could send the rocks tumbling too soon, or worse, upon herself. By midday, sweat soaked her clothing despite the cool mountain air. The support beneath the largest boulder was now significantly weakened, requiring only a firm push to send it crashing down. Satisfied with her work, Nahimana descended to the trail below and prepared the second phase of her plan. Using a fallen pine branch, she swept away her tracks, then constructed a small blind of branches near a bend in the trail. From this position, she would be invisible to the approaching caravan until they were directly below her trap. The waiting was the hardest part. Hours passed with agonizing slowness as Nahimana replayed every detail of her plan, identifying potential failures and adjusting accordingly. The sun began its westward arc, shadows lengthening across the canyon floor. Finally, the distant sound of wagon wheels and horses' hooves echoed through the canyon. Nahimana tensed, checking the pistol she had taken from the ambushers. 6 bullets. She would need to make each one count. The advance scouts appeared first, 2 riders moving cautiously along the narrow trail. They passed beneath her position without detecting her presence. Next came the main body of the caravan, Blackwood, at the front, followed by the wagons containing the captives. Nahimana waited, counting silently. Timing was everything. The first wagon rolled beneath the weakened boulder, then the second, her eyes fixed on the third wagon, where Mason and Kitchi were now held, separated from the other prisoners. As the third wagon reached the critical point, Nahimana raised the pistol and fired, not at the bounty hunters, but at the precariously balanced boulder above. The shot struck stone, sending fragments flying, but the boulder held. Cursing under her breath, she fired again. This time, the impact dislodged the supporting stones. With a grinding rumble that quickly became a roar, the boulder toppled, taking smaller rocks with it as it crashed down toward the trail. Chaos erupted below. Horses screamed in terror as the avalanche thundered down. The third wagon's driver tried to whip his team forward, but it was too late. Rocks slammed into the trail just behind the second wagon, obliterating the path and cutting off the third. In the confusion, Nahimana fired 3 rapid shots at the guards nearest the third wagon. 2 fell, while the third dove for cover. Blackwood wheeled his horse, shouting orders that were lost in the din of panicked animals and falling stone. Nahimana launched herself down the slope, sliding the last 15 feet to land beside the third wagon, just as Mason and Kitchi were breaking free of their loosened bonds. The collision had thrown their guards forward, giving them the opportunity they needed. Kitchi moved like lightning, wresting a rifle from a dazed guard and striking him with the butt. Mason, despite his wounded shoulder, had managed to arm himself with a fallen pistol. "The horses!" Nahimana shouted, pointing to the frightened team still harnessed to the wagon. Kitchi immediately began cutting them free, while Mason provided covering fire against the bounty hunters who were regrouping on the far side of the rock slide. Bullets whined past them, splintering wood and kicking up dust. "Blackwood's coming around the ridge," Mason warned, ducking as a shot narrowly missed his head. Nahimana glanced up to see the bounty hunter leading several men along a higher trail that bypassed the rock slide. They had minutes at most before they would be caught in a crossfire. Kitchi freed the last horse, helping Mason mount despite his injury. Nahimana swung onto another, while Kitchi took the third. Without saddles or proper bridles, controlling the animals would be challenging, especially on the treacherous mountain trails that lay ahead. "This way," Nahimana called, spurring her horse toward a game trail that branched from the main path. It was barely visible, known only to the Apache, who had hunted these mountains for generations. As they plunged into the forest, bullets tore through the foliage around them. Behind them, Blackwood's enraged shouts faded, replaced by the thundering of hooves as their pursuers gave chase. They had escaped the trap, but the hunt was far from over. And the remaining captives, including Nahimana's mother, were still in Blackwood's possession, their wagon now continuing unimpeded toward Fort Stanton. Nahimana exchanged a glance with Kitchi as they rode, a wordless communication born of shared history and purpose. They had won a small victory, but the greater battle still lay ahead, and this time Blackwood would be ready for them. Twilight settled over the mountains as Nahimana, Kitchi, and Mason finally slowed their exhausted horses. They had ridden hard, for hours, following game trails and dry creek beds to confuse their pursuers, doubling back and splitting up before rejoining at predetermined points. Now in a secluded box canyon, known only to the Mescalero, they paused to regroup. "We need to tend that wound," Nahimana said, dismounting and approaching Mason, who sat slumped in his saddle, face pale beneath the trail dust. Blackwood's bullet had torn through his shoulder, and though the bleeding had slowed, infection was the greater concern now. Mason grimaced as he dismounted, nearly collapsing before Kitchi stepped forward to support him. "I've had worse," Mason muttered, though his clenched jaw betrayed the intensity of his pain. "Sit," Nahimana commanded, gesturing toward a flat rock. She untied the medicine pouch from her neck and began gathering additional herbs from the surrounding vegetation. Kitchi secured the horses, then scouted the perimeter of their temporary sanctuary, his movements fluid, despite his own injuries. When he returned, he knelt beside Nahimana, speaking in their native tongue. "Blackwood's men have split into 3 groups," he reported. "They're combing the eastern slopes, but they've lost our trail for now." "Will they continue to Fort Stanton?" "With their captives?" she asked, crushing juniper berries between smooth river stones. Kitchi's expression darkened. "The main wagon train will proceed. Blackwood and his best trackers will hunt us. He cannot allow us to live. We know too much about his operation." Mason watched their exchange, understanding nothing of the words, but reading much in their expressions. "The fort," he said, wincing as Nahimana began cleaning his wound with water from her skin. "How much time do we have?" "2 days, perhaps less," Kitchi answered in English, his accent thicker but his vocabulary precise. "The wagon carrying your people will move slower than we did, but they have a head start." Nahimana applied a poultice of crushed herbs to Mason's wound, then bound it with strips torn from her undershirt. "This will draw out infection and dull the pain," she explained, "but you need real medicine." "What I need is to finish what we started," Mason replied, his eyes meeting hers with surprising intensity. "Your people aren't the only ones, Blackwood. As condemned to living death in those mines and camps." Kitchi studied the former soldier with newfound respect. "Why do you care so much about the fate of Apache?" A shadow crossed Mason's face. "My wife was half Cherokee. When the relocation orders came, the army didn't care about her white father or our marriage license. They took her east on one of those integration transports." His voice hardened. "I never saw her again." The revelation hung in the air between them, reshaping their understanding of this man who had risked everything for strangers. Nahimana's hands paused momentarily in their work before continuing to secure the bandage. "What is your plan now?" Kitchi asked, addressing both of them. "We are 3 against many, and our people grow more distant with each passing hour." Nahimana sat back on her heels, her mind working through their limited options. "We cannot overtake the wagon train directly. We would be outnumbered and outgunned. But I know these mountains better than any of Blackwood's men. There is another way to Fort Stanton." "The Switchback Trail," Kitchi said, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Through Devil's Canyon." Mason looked between them. "What's this trail?" "A dangerous path known only to our people," Nahimana explained. "It cuts through the highest peaks, saving nearly a day's journey, but few attempt it. Rockslides have claimed many lives there," Kitchi added, "and the trail itself is barely wide enough for a horse in places. One misstep means death." "Sounds perfect," Mason said with grim humor. "When do we leave?" "At first light," Nahimana decided. "We need rest, and the trail is too dangerous to navigate in darkness." As night deepened around them, they built a small, smokeless fire, sheltered by overhanging rocks to prevent its light from being visible to distant observers. They ate sparingly from the meager supplies in Nahimana's pouch, supplemented by roots and berries Kitchi gathered from the surrounding forest. While Mason dozed fitfully, his wound making restful sleep impossible, Nahimana and Kitchi spoke in low voices, their conversation returning to English when discussing strategy so Mason could participate. "If we reach the fort before the wagons," Nahimana began, tracing a rough map in the dirt with a stick, "we can set an ambush here at Eagle Pass. It's the last narrow approach before the open plains surrounding the fort." Kitchi nodded. "The wagons would be forced to slow there. But 3 against 12 or more?" Mason interjected, pushing himself up on his good arm. "Even with surprise, those odds are steep." "We will not be there for long," Kitchi said, exchanging a meaningful look with Nahimana. Understanding dawned on Mason's face. "There are more of your people nearby?" Nahimana hesitated before answering. Trust was still a fragile thing between them, despite all they had endured together. "When our settlement was attacked, not everyone was captured. The elders would have led the children to the summer hunting grounds in the high country. If we can reach them," Kitchi continued, "we might gather enough warriors for a proper rescue." Hope flickered in Mason's eyes, quickly tempered by practicality. "How far are these hunting grounds?" "A half-day's ride from the Switchback Trail," Nahimana replied. "But there's no guarantee they reached safety or that they have weapons." Or weight of this uncertainty settled over them. Their plan depended on too many unknown factors: the speed of the wagon train, the number of warriors they might recruit, their ability to navigate the treacherous trail ahead. Mason studied the rough map Nahimana had drawn, then added his own knowledge. Fort Stanton's western approach is lightly guarded. Most of their defenses face east, toward traditional Apache territory. His finger traced a line from the fort to a nearby river. And here, this is where they first process new captives, a holding area before assignment to the mines or camps. You know the fort well, Kitchi observed. I was stationed there for 3 months, Mason replied, long enough to learn its weaknesses. The night deepened around them as they refined their desperate plan. Outside their sheltered canyon, they knew Blackwood's men continued to search. Driven by both bounty and fear of their leader's wrath, we should sleep in shifts, Nahimana suggested. I'll take my first watch. Kitchi nodded, though reluctance showed in his eyes, not from fear of duty but concern for her. Wake me in. 3 hours. As the men settled into uneasy sleep, Nahimana climbed to a vantage point overlooking the canyon entrance. The night was clear, stars scattered across the vast darkness like the dust of ancestors' footsteps in Apache belief. She found the star. Patterns her grandmother had taught her, the Great Bear, the 7 Sisters, the Hunter, and drew strength from their familiar presence. Her mind turned to her mother, proud and unbowed even in captivity. What was she enduring now? Was she maintaining hope or preparing herself for the fate that awaited at Fort Stanton? The thought tightened Nahimana's grip on her rifle. Movement in the distance caught her attention, a flicker of torchlight on a far ridge. Blackwood's men still searching. They were persistent, she had to grant them that. But persistence alone wasn't enough in these mountains. Knowledge was power here. And in that arena, Nahimana held the advantage. As the night wore on, Nahimana mentally prepared for the journey ahead. The switchback trail would test them all, particularly Mason with his injury, but it represented their only hope of reaching Fort Stanton in time to save their people. When she woke Kitchi for his watch, their hands clasped briefly. A wordless exchange of strength and commitment that needed no elaboration. He understood, as she did, that what lay ahead might claim their lives. The path of the warrior often led to early graves, but to abandon their people to slavery and degradation was no choice at all. Before dawn touched the eastern sky, they were awake and preparing to move. The horses had rested enough to continue, though all 3 animals showed signs of the previous day's hard riding. Mason stood straighter this morning, Nahimana's medicine having reduced the inflammation in his wound. His face remained drawn with pain, but determination had returned to his eyes. The switchback trail begins just beyond that ridge, Nahimana said, pointing northward as they mounted. Once we start, there's no turning back. The path is too narrow for horses to pass one another. Then we don't turn back, Mason replied simply. Kitchi, who had been studying the landscape to the east, suddenly stiffened. Riders, he said, quietly, at least 5 following the stream bed. Nahimana and Mason turned to look. In the growing light they could just make out mounted figures moving through the valley below, methodically searching each branching canyon. Blackwood? Nahimana asked. Kitchi nodded. He leads them himself. Then we ride now, she decided, before they find our trail. Without another word, they urged their horses forward, leaving the shelter of the box canyon and climbing toward the forbidding peaks where the switchback trail awaited. Behind them, still unaware of their quarry's proximity, Blackwood and his men continued their systematic search. The hunt had truly begun, but now it was unclear who was the hunter and who was prey. As the rising sun gilded the mountain tops, with golden light, Nahimana allowed herself a grim smile. Let Blackwood come. On her ancestral lands, she feared no man, no matter how many guns rode at his side. The switchback trail lived up to its fearsome reputation. By midday, they had climbed so high that the valley floor was just a distant patchwork far below. The path twisted along sheer cliff faces. in places so narrow that their stirrups scraped against rock walls while their opposite legs dangled over 100-foot drops. Mason, despite his stoic demeanor, had begun to sway in his saddle, the combination of blood loss and altitude taking its toll. Nahimana rode directly behind him, ready to steady him if necessary. "We need to rest the horses," Kitchi called back, halting at a small plateau where the trail briefly widened. They dismounted carefully, the thin mountain air making even this simple task more demanding. Nahimana immediately checked Mason's wound, finding the bandages soaked through with fresh blood. "The climb has reopened," she said, concern evident in her voice. "We need to change the dressing." Mason leaned heavily against a boulder, his breathing labored. "Don't waste time. I'll make it." "You'll make it because we won't let you die," Nahimana replied firmly, already preparing fresh herbs from her pouch. While she tended to Mason, Kitchi surveyed their surroundings with a practiced eye. The view from this height was staggering, miles of forested mountains unfolding in every direction, the silver ribbon of the Rio Bonito winding through distant valleys, but more importantly, it allowed him to track their pursuers. "Blackwood has found our trail," he announced grimly. 6 riders, moving fast along the lower path. Nahimana glanced up from her work. "Will they attempt the switchback?" "White man would be foolish to try," Kitchi replied, "but Blackwood strikes me as both desperate and arrogant." "How long before they reach this point?" Mason asked, wincing as Nahimana tightened the fresh bandage. 4 hours, perhaps less, if they push their horses beyond wisdom. They allowed themselves only a brief rest before continuing. The trail grew, increasingly treacherous, winding through a section where recent rock slides had nearly obliterated the path. They were forced to dismount and lead the horses, testing each step before committing their weight. By late afternoon, they reached the most notorious section of the switchback, a narrow bridge of natural stone arching over a dizzying chasm. Wind howled through the gap, bringing with it the scent of coming rain. "Devil's Crossing," Nahimana said, the ancient Apache name for this treacherous passage. "We cross one at a time. The horses will be frightened. Cover their eyes, using strips of cloth." They blindfolded each horse before carefully leading them across one by one. The bridge, barely wider than a man's shoulders in places, creaked ominously beneath their weight. Kitchi went first, followed by Mason, with Nahimana bringing up the rear. They had nearly reached the far side when disaster struck. A sudden gust of wind, powerful enough to stagger them, caused Mason's horse to panic despite its blindfold. The animal reared, nearly throwing Mason over the edge. As he fought to control it, loose stones gave way beneath the horse's hooves. In an instant of terrible clarity, Nahimana saw what would happen next. The horse was going over, and Mason with it. Then, from nowhere, a lasso whipped through the air, settling around Mason's chest. A sharp tug yanked him clear of his mount, just as the terrified animal plunged into the abyss, its scream echoing off the canyon walls. Mason landed hard on the bridge, the breath knocked from his lungs, the lasso pulled taut by unseen hands on the far side of the chasm. "Move!" Kitchi shouted, grabbing Mason's collar and dragging him the final few feet to safety. Nahimana followed quickly, leading her nervous mount onto solid ground before turning to face their unexpected savior. A figure emerged from behind a cluster of boulders. A white man, tall and weathered, with iron-grey hair tied back beneath a battered cavalry hat. A Winchester rifle rested casually in the crook of his arm, and piercing blue eyes studied them with wary intelligence. "That's twice now I've saved someone from that damn bridge," the stranger drawled, coiling his rope with practiced ease. "Folks never learn." Kitchi had positioned himself protectively in front of Nahimana, his hand hovering near his knife. "Who are you?" he demanded. "Name's Jeremiah Wade," the man replied, making no move to approach closer. "This here's my mountain, more or less." His gaze fixed on Mason with sudden recognition. "Well, I'll be damned. Mason Thorne. Last I heard, you were deserting the army and putting a bullet in Lieutenant Phillips." Mason pushed himself to his feet, still catching his breath. "Wade, thought you were dead." "The Comanche raid at Yellow Fork. Greatly exaggerated," Wade replied with a thin smile. "Found it convenient to let folks think I'd gone under." His attention shifted to Nahimana and Kitchi. "Interesting company you're keeping these days." "They're friends," Mason said firmly. "And we're in a hurry." Wade's eyebrows rose. "Must be important to risk the switch back, especially with a bullet hole in you." "Blackwood's men are close behind us," Nahimana interjected, deciding directness was their best approach. "They've taken my people captive, bound for Fort Stanton and the mines beyond." Silas Blackwood. Wade's expression darkened. That explains plenty. He studied them for a long moment before coming to some internal decision. "My cabin's a quarter-mile ahead. Your man there won't make it much further without real doctoring, and that storm's going to break within the hour." Thunder rumbled in the distance, emphasizing his point. Dark clouds were gathering over the western peaks, promising a deluge that would make the switchback utterly impassable. "We don't have time to stop," Kitchi argued. "You don't have time not to," Wade countered. "Blackwood won't attempt the crossing in this weather. That buys you a few hours at least." He gestured to Mason, "And he's running on borrowed time as it is." Nahimana weighed their options quickly. Mason's condition was deteriorating, and the approaching storm would indeed halt their progress regardless. "Lead the way," she decided, ignoring Kitchi's look of disapproval. Wade's cabin proved to be a substantial structure built into the side of the mountain itself, partially concealed by natural rock formations and towering pines. Inside was unexpectedly well furnished, a far cry from the crude shelter they had anticipated. "Army retirement didn't suit me," Wade explained, noting their surprise as he stoked the fire in a large stone hearth. "Been up here for nearly 7 years now. Get supply runs from a Jicarilla trader every few months, otherwise keep to myself." While Kitchi remained watchful by the window, Wade examined Mason's wound with practiced hands. "Clean through, at least. No bullet to dig out." He reached for a worn medical kit. "Army surgeon for 20 years before I took my commission. Guess some skills don't fade." As Wade worked, Nahimana studied their unexpected benefactor more carefully. His cabin walls held an eclectic collection of items: Apache baskets alongside cavalry sabers, Navajo blankets next to surveyor's maps. "You know these mountains well?" she asked. Wade nodded, not looking up from his work. "Better than most. Mapped half of them myself back when the Army was first establishing the territory." "Then you know about Fort Stanton and what happens there?" Wade's hands paused momentarily. "I know enough," he replied, voice carefully neutral. "Enough to keep my distance. Yet you live as a neighbor to such evil." The accusation hung in the air between them. Wade finished bandaging Mason's shoulder before answering. "There's evil in every direction, girl," he said finally. "Man can only fight so many battles before he learns to choose carefully. And you chose to hide," Kitchi remarked from his position by the window. Wade's eyes flashed. "I chose to survive, something your people understand better than most." He turned back to Nahimana. "I know why you're heading to Fort Stanton. I also know it's suicide. Blackwood has 30 men at his call, plus whatever support Colonel Walton provides." "We plan to reach the summer hunting grounds," Nahimana explained. "There are warriors there who will join us." Wade shook his head. "No one's at the summer grounds. The Army raided them 3 days ago." The news hit Nahimana like a physical blow. "What?" "Coordinated attacks," Wade confirmed grimly. "While Blackwood hit your settlement, the Army swept through the hunting grounds. They're executing Walton's new strategy: eliminate all Apache presence within 50 miles of the fort." Silence fell as the implications sank in. Their desperate plan had just lost its foundation. "How do you know this?" Kitchi demanded suspiciously. "I have my ways of hearing things," Wade replied vaguely. "Keeping informed has kept me alive this long, Outside, the storm broke with sudden fury, rain lashing against the cabin's small windows. Thunder cracked directly overhead, the sound reverberating through the mountain. "You're welcome to wait out the storm," Wade said, rising to his feet. "But come morning, I suggest you find another path. The three of you against Fort Stanton is a fool's errand." Mason, now more alert thanks to Wade's ministrations, spoke up. "We're not abandoning those people, Wade, not to Walton's mines." A complex emotion passed across Wade's weathered face. "Always the idealist, Thorne. It's why you never made it past captain." He moved to a cabinet and withdrew a bottle of whiskey. "It's also why Phillips is walking with a limp these days." Nahimana stepped forward, her patience wearing thin. "We did not ask for your approval, only shelter from the storm. At dawn, we continue to Fort Stanton, with or without your blessing." Wade studied her with newfound respect. "Got fire in you, didn't you? Reminds me of someone I used to know." He poured 4 glasses of whiskey, offering them around. "To lost causes, then. God knows I've fought enough of them myself." The storm raged through the night, confining them to the cabin and an uneasy truce with their mysterious host. As Kitchie and Mason finally succumbed to exhaustion, Nahimana remained awake, watching Wade as he sat by the fire, methodically cleaning the Winchester that never left his reach. "You know more than you're saying," she stated quietly. Wade didn't look up from his work. "Most men do. About Blackwood, about Fort Stanton, about my people." Now Wade did look up, his eyes reflecting. "The firelight. Knowledge is dangerous out here, girl, for all of us." "My name is Nahimana, not girl," she corrected, "and danger is all that remains for me now." A faint smile touched Wade's lips. "Fair enough, Nahimana." He reassembled his rifle with practiced precision. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow will demand everything you have." As she settled onto a bedroll near the fire, Nahimana couldn't shake the feeling that Jeremiah Wade represented both an unexpected ally and a new complication in their desperate mission. His knowledge could save them, or his secrets could destroy them. Only the dawn would tell which path he would choose. Dawn broke over Fort Stanton, pale light seeping through the cracks in the weathered boards of the holding pen where the captured Mescalero sat in weary silence. The night's journey had been brutal. Hours of being jostled in crowded wagons, no food, minimal water, and the constant threat of violence from their captors. Nahimana's mother, Taluta, sat with her back against the rough wall, her eyes closed, but her mind alert. Around her, women and children huddled together for warmth, their blankets and most of their possessions having been confiscated upon arrival. The men had been separated immediately, taken to a different compound that stood ominously on the far side of the fort. "Grandmother, I'm thirsty," whispered a small boy beside her, no more than 6 years old. Taluta opened her eyes, placing a gentle hand on the child's shoulder. He wasn't her grandson by blood, but such distinctions meant little now. They were all family in their shared fate. "They will bring water soon," she assured him, though she had no reason to believe this was true. The guards had shown little concern for their captive's needs thus far. As if summoned by her thoughts, the door to the pen swung open. A young soldier entered, carrying a wooden bucket and a single ladle. Behind him stood a red-faced sergeant, hand resting casually on his holstered pistol. "Water ration," the sergeant announced. "Form a line, 1 drink each." The Apache women exchanged glances, none moving immediately. These men expected immediate obedience, but Taluta had observed that small moments of defiance, controlled, measured resistance, unsettled them more than outright rebellion, which they knew how to handle with violence. After a calculated delay, Taluta rose slowly to her feet, her bearing regal despite her circumstances. "The children will drink first," she stated, her English clear and deliberate. The sergeant's face darkened. "You don't give orders here, squaw." "It is not an order," Taluta replied evenly. "It is what will happen." A tense silence followed as the other women rose to stand behind her, their collective will forming an invisible shield. The sergeant assessed the situation, apparently deciding this wasn't a battle worth fighting. "Fine," he spat. "Kids first, but make it quick." As the children lined up for water, Taluta took the opportunity to study the fort's layout through the open door. She memorized the positions of guards, the patterns of their movement, the location of storehouses and stables. Such knowledge might prove vital in days to come. When the water distribution finished, the young soldier retreated, but the sergeant lingered, studying Taluta with narrowed eyes. "You're the medicine woman," he said abruptly. "Blackwood mentioned you." Taluta neither confirmed nor denied this, meeting his gaze steadily. "Colonel wants to see you," he continued. "Says you might be useful." 2 additional guards appeared at the doorway, their presence making the sergeant's intention clear. This was not a request. The women around Taluta moved closer protectively, but she shook her head slightly. Creating a confrontation now would only bring punishment to all. "I will return," she assured them in Apache, then stepped forward to follow. The sergeant, as they crossed the fort's central yard, Taluta absorbed every detail: the number of soldiers, their weapons, the fort's vulnerabilities. Most importantly, she noted the location where the male prisoners were being held, searching for a glimpse of familiar faces among them. They led her to the commander's office, a well-appointed room that stood in stark contrast to the crude holding. Pens. Behind a large oak desk sat Colonel Walton, a thin man with calculating eyes and a meticulously groomed mustache. Standing to his side was Blackwood, his imposing frame seeming too large for the civilized setting. "The medicine woman, sir," the sergeant announced before withdrawing and closing the door. Colonel Walton studied her with academic interest. "I understand you speak English quite well," he began. "Missionary school, I presume." Taluta remained silent, her expression impassive. "Your cooperation would make things considerably easier," Walton continued, unperturbed by her silence. "For yourself and your people." "What do you want?" Taluta finally asked, her voice steady. Walton smiled. Thinly, direct, good. He leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "I have a proposition. Your knowledge of native remedies could be valuable to the fort's medical officer. In exchange for your assistance, you would receive better accommodations than your companions, perhaps even certain privileges. You ask me to heal the men who imprison my people?" The question contained no hint of outrage, merely clarification. "I ask you to be practical," Walton replied. "The future of the Apache in this territory is already determined. Individual choices now only affect how comfortably one lives within that future." Blackwood shifted impatiently. "Don't waste time negotiating with her, Colonel. These people only understand force." Walton raised a hand for silence, his eyes never leaving Taluta. "Consider your options carefully. Tomorrow, the men will be transported to the Riley Creek mines. The younger women and children will go east to the Indian schools. The rest," he trailed off meaningfully. "Labor is always needed on the frontier." Taluta absorbed this information, her heart sinking even as her face remained impassive. Riley Creek was notorious. Few survived its punishing conditions for more than a year, and the so-called schools were designed to erase Apache identity, language and culture. "My daughter," she said suddenly, "Nahimana, she was not among those captured." A flicker of annoyance crossed Blackwood's face. "She helped the deserter and another prisoner escape. They won't get far." Hope surged within Taluta, carefully concealed behind her stoic expression. If Nahimana was free and with allies, perhaps, there was still a chance. "I will consider your offer," she told Walton, buying time. "I must pray for guidance." Walton nodded, seemingly satisfied. "You have until morning. After that, the wagons leave, with or without you on them." He gestured. "To the guards. Take her back. As they escorted her across the yard, Taluta spotted a familiar face among the male prisoners being marched to a work detail, Elder Hanska, his weathered face bearing fresh bruises, but his eyes alert. Their gazes met briefly, a wealth of communication passing between them in that instant. Back in the holding pen, the women gathered around her eagerly. "What did they want?" asked Kimi, a young mother whose infant had been taken from her upon arrival. Taluta relayed the conversation in hushed tones, including the critical information about their planned separation and transport the following day. "They wish to divide us," she concluded. "Our strength is in our unity. What can we do?" Another woman asked, despair evident in her voice. "We have no weapons, no means of escape." Taluta's expression hardened with resolve. "We have our minds, our spirits, and knowledge they do not expect us to possess." She glanced meaningfully at the youngest woman. "Tonight several of you will fall ill with great drama. When they come to investigate, we will have our opportunity." Understanding dawned in their eyes. It was a desperate plan, but desperation was all they had left. As darkness fell over Fort Stanton, Taluta led the women in prayer, their voices a low murmur that the guards dismissed as harmless native superstition. In reality, she was preparing them for what lay ahead, assigning roles, establishing signals, strengthening their resolve. "My daughter comes," she told them with quiet certainty, "but we must be ready to seize our own freedom when the moment arrives." Miles away, in the darkness of Jeremiah Wade's mountain cabin, Nahimana awoke suddenly from a troubled sleep, her mother's voice echoing in her mind as clearly as if she stood beside her. She rose silently, moving to the window where the storm still raged, though with lessening fury. Dawn would bring choices, whether to trust Wade, how to proceed against seemingly impossible odds, what sacrifices might be necessary. But of one thing she was certain: her mother was alive and fighting in her own way. That knowledge hardened Nahimana's resolve like steel in fire. In the fort's holding pen, Taluta gazed at the rough planks above her, sensing her daughter's determination. Across the miles that separated them, a faint smile touched her lips. Blackwood and Walton believed they had captured broken victims, resigned to their fate. They would soon discover they had caged warriors instead. As the night deepened, Kimi began to moan, clutching her stomach in apparent agony. Other women gathered around her, their cries of concern gradually rising in volume. When the performance reached its peak, a guard finally banged on the door. "What's all that racket in there?" he demanded. Taluta approached the door, her expression grave. "The young mother is very ill. Without her child, her milk has poisoned her blood." The guard hesitated, uncertain. "I'll get the sergeant." As his footsteps receded, Taluta turned to the women with fierce determination. "Prepare yourselves," she commanded quietly. "Tonight, we begin our resistance." Outside, the storm that had raged over the mountains finally broke over Fort Stanton, as if nature itself had aligned with their cause. Thunder rattled the thin walls of the holding pen, and in its rolling echo, Taluta heard the ancient drums of her people, calling them to courage, to defiance, to survival. Morning arrived with unexpected clarity at Wade's cabin, the storm having spent its fury during the night. Nahimana stood on the porch, watching the sun illuminate the valley below, turning raindrops on pine needles into countless tiny diamonds. "Storm cleared faster than I expected," Wade commented, joining her with 2 steaming cups of coffee. He offered one to her. "Your window of opportunity just narrowed." "What do you mean?" Nahimana asked, accepting the cup cautiously. "Blackwood's men would have waited out the storm at Devil's Bridge. They'll be moving again within the hour." Wade leaned against the porch railing. "And the supply wagon leaves for Fort Stanton at noon. If your people are being transported to the mines today, that's your only chance to reach them before they're gone." Nahimana's gaze sharpened. What supply wagon? Weekly provisions from Dawson's trading post, Fort Contract. Wade sipped his coffee. Army's too busy playing Indian hunter to farm their own food. Inside the cabin, Mason and Kitchi were gathering their meager supplies, their voices drifting through the open door as they debated their next move. Mason's condition had improved dramatically under Wade's care. His movements still stiff, but no longer life-threatening. You know a great deal about fort operations for someone who claims to keep his distance, Nahimana observed. Wade's eyes crinkled slightly at the corners. Knowledge is survival out here. He straightened, setting down his empty cup. I've made a decision that my better judgment is screaming against, which is, I'm going to help you. He raised a hand to forestall her response. Not out of charity or sudden moral awakening. Blackwood and Walton have been expanding their operation. Eventually, they'll come for this mountain too. Before Nahimana could respond, Mason and Kitchi emerged from the cabin. Mason's eyes narrowed suspiciously at Wade. What's this about helping us? He asked. Wade turned to face them. I know a way into Fort Stanton that doesn't involve suicide charges or hopeless frontal assaults. Kitchi crossed his arms. Why would you risk yourself for Apache strangers? I'm not, Wade replied bluntly. I'm eliminating a threat to my peaceful retirement. If that means helping you free your people, so be it. Mason studied his former comrade skeptically. You were never the altruistic type, Wade. Still not, Wade agreed. But I've spent 7 years avoiding entanglement in territorial politics. Now Walton's making that impossible. He gestured toward a detailed map, spread on a table just inside the doorway. You want to save your people or debate my character? The four gathered around the map, a military survey of Fort Stanton and its surroundings far more detailed than anything they could have hoped for otherwise. The fort was built with its defenses oriented toward traditional Apache raiding approaches from the east, Wade explained, pointing to the fortifications. The western approach, where the supply road comes in, is relatively vulnerable. It's guarded but not heavily. How many men does Walton command? Mason asked. Officially 50, in practice closer to 35 combat ready. The rest are clerks, cooks, and aging officers counting the days to pension. Wade's finger moved to a building marked within the fort's walls. This is where they'll hold the women and children. The men will be in the north compound here, awaiting transport to the mines. Nahimana leaned forward. When will they be moved? If standard procedure holds, the mining transport leaves at dawn tomorrow. Once they're on that wagon train, retrieving them becomes significantly more difficult. So today is our only chance, Kitchi stated grimly. Wade nodded. The supply wagon. From Dawson's presence, your best opportunity. It's scheduled to arrive at the fort by late afternoon. 2 men drive it, usually Dawson's son Timothy and a hired hand. You're suggesting we intercept the wagon? Mason asked, following Wade's thinking. Precisely. Replace the drivers, enter the fort legitimately, and operate from within. Wade traced the route on the map. The wagon follows this road through Hackberry Canyon. Narrow passage, perfect for an ambush. Nahimana exchanged glances with Kitchi, seeing her own concerns mirrored in his eyes. Even if we successfully enter the fort, we'd still be vastly outnumbered. Which is why you need a distraction, Wade replied. Something to draw the soldiers away from their posts, create confusion. Such as, Mason prompted. Wade's expression grew calculating. Blackwood's bounty hunters are still searching for you. If they were to, say, attack the fort under the impression that Walton was harboring you. A slow smile spread across Mason's face. That's devious, Wade, even for you. Blackwood and Walton are allies, but it's an alliance of convenience, Wade explained. There's no love lost between them. With the right misinformation, we could turn them against each other temporarily. Kitchi looked skeptical. How would we convince Blackwood to attack the fort? Leave that to me, Wade said. "I've dealt with his type before. Greed and paranoia make men predictable." The plan developed rapidly, each contributing their knowledge and skills. Wade would intercept Blackwood, feeding him false information about Mason's whereabouts and Walton's supposed betrayal. Meanwhile, Nahimana, Kitchi, and Mason would ambush the supply wagon and use it to enter the fort during the ensuing chaos. "Once inside," Mason continued, tracing their route on the map, "we head directly to the holding areas. Nahimana takes the women's compound, I take the men's. Kitchi secures our escape route." "The main gate will be watched," Wade cautioned, "but there's a service entrance here used for removing waste. It's guarded by a single sentry, typically the newest recruit assigned the least desirable duty." "That's our exit," Nahimana decided. "We'll need horses waiting beyond the perimeter." "Already handled," Wade replied, surprising them. "I've got 4 mounts hidden in a ravine half a mile west of the fort. Been there since yesterday." Mason's eyebrows rose. "You've been planning this longer than you let on." Wade shrugged. "Let's just say I've been considering contingencies for some time. Fort Stanton has been a growing problem for years." As they finalized the details, Nahimana felt a curious blend of hope and suspicion. Wade's assistance was invaluable, but his motivations remained murky at best. Still, they had little choice but to trust him, at least as far as their interests aligned. By mid-morning, they were prepared to depart. Wade had provided them with additional weapons and supplies, including a small canvas bag that he handed. "To Nahimana, with particular care, blasting powder," he explained. "Military grade. If you need to create a secondary distraction inside the fort, this will do it. Place it near the ammunition store for maximum effect." Nahimana secured the bag, nodding her understanding. The weight of it against her hip was both reassuring and terrifying, power and responsibility in equal measure. Outside, Wade mounted his horse, checking his Winchester one final time. "I'll find Blackwood, set him on Walton's trail. With luck, he'll reach the fort just after you've secured the supply wagon." "And if he doesn't believe you?" Kitchi asked. "Then you'll have one less problem to deal with," Wade replied grimly. "Either way, I'll meet you at Devil's Peak tomorrow at sundown, assuming any of us survive this foolishness." As Wade prepared to depart, Mason approached him, extending his hand. "I misjudged you, Jeremiah." Wade accepted the handshake with a wry smile. "Don't canonize me yet, Thorne. If this goes badly, I'll deny knowing any of you." The 4 riders split at the trail junction, Wade heading east toward Blackwood's likely position, while Nahimana, Kitchi, and Mason turned west toward Hackberry Canyon and the approaching supply wagon. They rode in tense silence, each absorbed in private thoughts about the dangerous gambit ahead. The plan contained too many variables, too many opportunities for failure, but it was the only hope they had of reaching the captives before they were scattered beyond recovery. As they approached Hackberry Canyon, Kitchi scouted ahead, returning quickly with confirmation. "The wagon approaches. 2 men, as Wade predicted. They'll reach the narrow passage in 20 minutes. Nahimana dismounted, tying her horse in a sheltered grove. "We'll need them alive and unharmed," she reminded. "The others. Their cooperation might prove useful." Mason nodded, checking his borrowed pistol. "No unnecessary violence, but we can't afford hesitation either." They positioned themselves carefully. Kitchi hidden above the trail on a rocky outcropping, Nahimana and Mason on opposite sides of the narrow passage. The plan was simple. Kitchi would startle the horses with a warning shot, bringing the wagon to a halt, while Nahimana and Mason would emerge with weapons drawn, giving the drivers no choice but surrender. The creak of wagon wheels announced the approach of their target. Nahimana pressed herself against the canyon wall, controlling her breathing as the conveyance came into view. A large, canvas-covered wagon pulled by 4 sturdy mules, laden with supplies for the fort. As the wagon entered the narrowest section of the canyon, Kitchi's rifle cracked. The shot struck the ground directly in front of the lead mules, causing them to rear in panic. The driver cursed, struggling to control the team as the wagon lurched to a halt. "Don't move," Mason shouted, stepping into view with his pistol trained. On the driver's hands, where I can see them, Nahimana emerged from the opposite side, her own weapon steady. The two men on the wagon seat froze, slowly raising their hands. "This is a mistake," the older driver said, his voice steady despite his obvious fear. "We're just delivering supplies to the fort. We don't carry valuables." "We don't want your supplies," Nahimana replied. "We want your wagon." Understanding dawned in the younger driver's eyes. "You're the Apache woman they're hunting, and you're the deserter." "Perceptive," Mason commented. "Now climb down, slowly." As the men complied, Kitchi descended from his position, quickly binding. Their hands with leather straps. Neither resisted, recognizing the futility of struggling against armed captors. "What will you do with us?" the older man asked, eyeing them warily. "No harm if you cooperate," Nahimana assured him. "We need information about the fort's routine, how supplies are checked, who you speak with upon arrival." The men exchanged glances before the older one sighed. "Timothy Dawson," he introduced. Himself reluctantly. "This is my brother Samuel. Our father owns the trading post. Tell us everything," Mason instructed, "and you'll be released once we're safely away." As Timothy began detailing the fort's supply procedures, Nahimana felt time pressing upon them like a physical weight. Each passing minute brought their quarry closer to transport and permanent separation. The most dangerous part of their mission still lay ahead, infiltrating Fort Stanton itself, where 35 armed soldiers and an unknown number of bounty hunters awaited. But for the first time since the attack on her settlement, she allowed herself to believe success might be possible. They had a plan. They had allies, however questionable. And most importantly, they had reached the point of no return, the moment when desperate hope transforms into resolute action. The supply wagon rumbled toward Fort Stanton as the afternoon sun began its descent behind the western mountains. Mason handled the reins, his military jacket buttoned precisely, hat pulled low over his eyes. Beside him, Nahimana sat with head bowed, her hair tucked beneath a worn slouch hat, face deliberately smudged with dirt to obscure her features. Both wore clothes taken from the Dawson brothers, who now lay bound but unharmed in a secluded ravine, watched over by a promise to return and free them after nightfall. Kitchi had separated from them an hour earlier, making his way to the ravine where Wade had concealed the horses for their escape. The plan required him to be in position outside the fort's waste exit, ready to assist the captives when the time came. "Almost there," Mason murmured, as the fort's walls appeared in the distance. "Remember, keep your head down. Let me do the—" "In talking," Nahimana nodded, her hand resting near the pistol concealed beneath her oversized coat. Beneath the wagon's canvas, carefully hidden among flour sacks and coffee tins, lay the blasting powder Wade had provided. Fort Stanton loomed larger. With each passing minute, its adobe and timber walls rising from the scrubland like an alien intrusion upon the landscape. The western gate stood open, guarded by two soldiers who looked bored and uncomfortable in the late afternoon heat. Mason slowed the wagon as they approached, adopting the casual posture and unhurried manner of a routine delivery driver. One guard stepped forward, rifle held loosely in his hands. "Halt for inspection," he called, more from habit than genuine vigilance. Mason tugged on the reins, bringing the mules to a stop. "Afternoon, Private," he greeted, his voice a careful imitation of Timothy Dawson's casual drawl. "Weekly provisions from the trading post." The guard nodded, approaching the wagon. "New helper?" he asked, eyeing Nahimana suspiciously. "My cousin from Santa Fe," Mason replied smoothly, "teaching him the routes." The guard seemed satisfied, beginning a cursory inspection of the visible cargo. "Didn't expect you so late. Storm delay you?" Washed out part of the trail, Mason confirmed. Had to take the long way around. As the guard completed his inspection, a commotion near the eastern gate drew his attention. Raised voices, then the distinct sound of approaching riders. Many of them. "What the hell?" the guard muttered, turning toward the sound. Mason and Nahimana exchanged quick glances. Wade had succeeded in his part of the plan. "Better get this wagon inside," Mason suggested casually. "Sounds like trouble brewing." The guard hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Go on through. Unload at the usual spot." Mason flicked the reins, guiding the wagon through the gate just as an officer appeared, shouting orders for the guards to take defensive positions. "Blackwood's men approaching from the east," the officer called. "All hands to stations." Soldiers began rushing toward the eastern wall, creating exactly the diversion they had hoped for. Mason steered the wagon toward the central yard, where supplies were typically unloaded. As they passed the women's holding area, Nahimana caught a glimpse of faces peering through crude windows, her people watching and waiting. "The diversion won't last long," Mason muttered. "Once Blackwood and Walton sort out their misunderstanding, they'll realize they've been manipulated." Nahimana nodded, already scanning the fort's layout, confirming it matched Wade's map. "There," she whispered, gesturing subtly toward a storage building near the men's compound. "The powder will create maximum confusion there." Mason guided the wagon to the designated unloading area, where a single-board quartermaster awaited them. Outside the fort walls, they could hear the growing confrontation, Blackwood's men demanding entry, accusations being shouted, threats exchanged. "Good timing," the quartermaster commented as they halted. "Whole fort's going crazy. Blackwood claims we're harboring fugitives or some nonsense." "That right," Mason replied, playing ignorant as he secured the reins. "Sounds serious." The quartermaster snorted. "That bounty hunter's been a pain in Colonel Walton's side for months, getting too big for his britches." He approached the wagon, clipboard in hand. "Let's make this quick. I'm supposed to be at my post with all this commotion." Nahimana slipped from the wagon while the quartermaster's attention was on Mason and the inventory list. Moving with deliberate casualness, she began unloading boxes, gradually working her way toward the back, where the blasting powder was concealed. Gunfire erupted suddenly from the direction of the east gate. A series of sharp cracks, followed by shouted orders. "Damn it all," the quartermaster cursed, setting down his clipboard. "Wait here. Don't unload anything else until I get back." He hurried away, hand moving to the pistol at his side. The moment he disappeared around a corner, Nahimana and Mason sprang into action. "I'll get the powder to the storage building," she said urgently. "You free the men. Meet at the waste exit in 15 minutes. Mason nodded, checking his pistol. "Be careful. If you're not there in 15 minutes, I will be," she interrupted. "Go!" They separated, each moving with purpose through the chaotic fort. Most soldiers had rushed to the eastern wall, leaving the interior relatively unguarded. Nahimana retrieved the canvas bag of blasting powder, concealing it beneath her coat as she made her way toward the storage building. Inside the women's holding pen, Taluta heard the commotion and recognized it for what it was. Opportunity. The evening before, their feigned illness had created enough distraction for her to secure a rusty nail from the floorboards. Throughout the night, the women had taken turns working at the door's hinges, weakening them just enough to give way. Under sufficient force, "It is time," Taluta announced quietly. The women gathered around her, faces resolute. "When the guards are fully distracted, we break through." Mason reached the men's compound, finding 2 guards rather than the expected one. The heightened alert had doubled the security. He approached openly, maintaining his delivery driver persona. "Got medical supplies for the prisoners," he called, holding up a small box he'd grabbed from the wagon. "Quartermaster's orders." The guards exchanged uncertain glances. "We didn't hear about any medical supplies," one said suspiciously. Mason shrugged. "Take it up with the quartermaster. I just go where I'm told." The more senior guard frowned, then nodded reluctantly. "Make it quick, no funny business." As the guard unlocked the gate, Mason spotted Kitchi through a gap in the fort's western wall, positioned exactly where he should be. Everything was aligned. If they could maintain the deception for just a few more minutes. Meanwhile, Nahimana had reached the storage building, slipping inside unnoticed amid the growing chaos. The building was stacked with crates of ammunition, barrels of powder, and other supplies, a perfect target. Working quickly, she positioned Wade's blasting powder near the largest concentration of explosive materials, preparing the fuse as he had instructed. Just as she finished, the door behind her opened. She turned to find herself facing a young soldier, his eyes widening with recognition. "You're the Apache woman," he gasped, reaching for his sidearm. "The one Blackwood's hunting." Nahimana lunged forward before he could draw, driving her shoulder into his midsection. They crashed to the floor together, struggling fiercely. The soldier was stronger, but Nahimana fought with desperate intensity, knowing discovery now meant death for all of them. His hand closed around her throat, cutting off her air. Spots danced before her eyes as she fumbled at her belt, fingers closing around her knife. With the last of her strength, she drove it into his side. Not a killing blow, but enough to make him release his grip with a pained cry. Nahimana rolled away, gasping for breath. The soldier staggered to his feet, blood seeping between the fingers pressed to his wound. He reached again for his pistol. "Don't!" Nahimana warned, raising her own weapon. "I don't want to kill you." The soldier hesitated, eyes darting between her face and the fuse she had prepared. Understanding dawned in his expression. "You're going to blow up the fort," he said incredulously. "Only the ammunition," she corrected, "and only as a distraction. If you raise the alarm now, people will die needlessly, including you." Something in her direct gaze made him pause. "Why are you doing this?" "To free my people before they're sold into slavery in your minds," Nahimana answered honestly. "Would you not do the same for your family?" Conflict played across the young soldier's face. What happened next would determine all their fates. Inside the men's compound, Mason had encountered Kitchi's father among the captured Apache warriors. The older man's eyes had sparked with recognition despite Mason's disguise. "We have little time," Mason murmured in broken Apache as he pretended to check the man's injuries. "Be ready to move when the explosion comes." Outside the fort, the confrontation between Blackwood and Colonel Walton had escalated. Walton stood atop the eastern wall, his voice carrying clearly over the fortifications. "Your accusation is absurd, Blackwood. Why would I harbor the very deserter I've posted a bounty for?" Blackwood's response was equally heated. "Because you're planning to cheat me out of my rightful payment for these Apache. Wade confirmed you've been dealing directly with the mining companies." The mention of Wade's name sent a chill through Walton. The plot was becoming clearer. Someone was playing them against each other. But to what end? Realization struck him like a physical blow. "The Apache captives," he muttered. Then louder to his lieutenant, "Double the guards on the prisoners, now!" But his order came too late. Inside the storage building, Nahimana had made her decision. With a silent prayer to her ancestors, she struck the match and lit the fuse. "Run!" she told the wounded soldier. "You have 2 minutes." To her surprise, the young man hesitated, then extended his hand. "William Parker," he said. "Remember that name. I won't be raising the alarm." Nahimana took his hand briefly, a moment of unlikely connection amid chaos. "Nahimana, now go, William Parker. Live to make better choices than your commanders." As they separated, he toward the infirmary, she toward the women's compound, Nahimana felt the strange threads of fate weaving together. The explosion would come in less than 2 minutes. Mason should be positioning the male prisoners now. Kitchi would be ready at the escape point. All that remained was to free her mother and the women, then guide them through the chaos that was about to engulf Fort Stanton. The revolution was about to begin. The explosion rocked Fort Stanton with devastating force. The ammunition storage erupted in a massive fireball, sending debris hundreds of feet into the air and creating a shockwave that knocked soldiers off their feet throughout the compound. Secondary explosions followed as caches of gunpowder ignited, multiplying the chaos beyond anything Nahimana had anticipated. Thick, black smoke billowed across the fort, obscuring visibility and sending soldiers rushing in all directions, unsure whether they were under Apache attack or if Blackwood's men had somehow breached the walls. Orders and counter-orders echoed across the yard, adding to the confusion. Nahimana seized the moment, racing toward the women's compound through the blinding smoke. She reached the door just as it burst outward, kicked from within by the combined strength of several women. Taluta emerged first, her expression fierce. "With determination, Mother," Nahimana cried, embracing her briefly. "I knew you would come," Taluta replied, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "The others are ready." 27 women and children poured from the building, moving with disciplined urgency despite days of captivity. They had prepared for this moment, each knowing their role in the escape plan Taluta had devised. "This way," Nahimana directed, leading them toward the western wall, where the waste exit awaited. "Stay low, use the smoke for cover." Across the compound, Mason had used the explosion to overpower the guards at the men's holding area. The Apache warriors, though weakened by confinement and mistreatment, fought with coordinated precision, subduing their captors without raising further alarm. "The west exit," Mason told them, pressing a ring of keys into the hands of Kitchi's father. "Your women and children will meet you there." "You are not coming?" the elder asked. Mason shook his head. "I need to ensure Blackwood doesn't follow. Go." As the male prisoners slipped away through the smoke, Mason turned toward the eastern gate, where the confrontation between Blackwood and Walton continued. The explosion had momentarily shifted their attention, but both leaders were quickly realizing they had been manipulated. Their temporary feud would soon be forgotten in favor of stopping the escaping prisoners. Meanwhile, at the waste exit, a small gate used for removing refuse from the fort, Kitchi had eliminated the single guard with silent efficiency. He now waited, watching the chaos unfold within the walls, counting the seconds until his people would emerge. His patience was rewarded as Nahimana appeared through the smoke, leading the women and children toward the exit. Behind them, the male prisoners were visible, moving in a protective formation. Their timing was perfect, the entire group converging on the escape point simultaneously. "The horses are ready," Kitchi told Nahimana as the first escapees passed through the gate. 2 miles west, in the ravine Wade described. Nahimana nodded, continuing to direct the flow of escapees while scanning for pursuit. "Where is Mason?" "He didn't come with the men," Kitchi replied, concern evident in his voice. Before Nahimana could respond, a shout rang out from within the fort. Their escape had been discovered. A soldier appeared through the smoke, raising his rifle to fire at the fleeing Apaches. Kitchi reacted instantly, his thrown knife finding its mark before the man could pull the trigger. But the alarm had been raised. More soldiers would come soon. "Get them to the horses," Nahimana ordered, pressing her pistol into Kitchi's hand. "I'll find Mason." Kitchi caught her arm. "It's too dangerous." "He risked everything for our people," she replied firmly. "I won't leave him to die." Their eyes held for a brief moment, 1,000 unspoken things passing between them. Then Kitchi nodded, accepting her decision with reluctant understanding. "Lead them to Hawk's Ridge," Nahimana told her mother. "We'll join you there by morning." Taluta clasped her daughter's hands. "May the ancestors guide your path," she said. Before turning to help organize the escaping Apaches, Nahimana slipped back into the fort, moving against the flow of escaping prisoners. The smoke provided cover, but it also made navigation treacherous. Fires had broken out in several buildings, and soldiers rushed in all directions, attempting to contain both the blaze and the escaping captives. At the eastern gate, Colonel Walton had finally grasped the true nature of the situation. "It's a rescue operation," he shouted to his officers. "The explosion was a diversion. Seal all exits immediately." Blackwood, watching from outside the walls, came to the same realization. "They played us against each other," he growled to his lieutenant. "While we argued, they infiltrated the fort." His face darkened with rage as understanding dawned. "Wade," he spat. "This has Jeremiah Wade written all over it." Without waiting for Walton's permission, Blackwood spurred his horse forward, leading his men toward the fort's western side, where the terrain suggested the most likely escape route. He would not lose his valuable captives, or the chance to settle scores with Wade and the deserter. Inside the burning fort, Mason had positioned himself at a critical junction, using a fallen soldier's rifle to pin down a squad attempting to intercept the escaping prisoners. His military training served him well, allowing him to hold multiple soldiers at bay with precision fire. When his ammunition ran out, he retreated deeper into the smoke, seeking another weapon. Rounding a corner, he collided with Colonel Walton, himself accompanied by two junior officers. Recognition was immediate and mutual. "Thorn," Walton snarled, drawing his sidearm. Mason knocked the colonel's arm aside as he fired, the bullet going wide. The two men grappled fiercely, crashing into a burning supply cart. The junior officers moved to intervene, but the cart collapsed, sending burning debris between them and the struggling men. "You betrayed your oath," Walton gasped as Mason's hands closed around his throat. "Your country!" "I honored my oath," Mason replied through gritted teeth, "to protect the innocent from men like you." Their struggle carried them toward the edge of the parade ground, where the smoke briefly thinned. Mason gained the upper hand, driving Walton to his knees with a powerful blow. Just as victory seemed certain, a rifle shot cracked through the air. Mason staggered, a bloom of red spreading across his side. He turned to see a soldier taking aim for a second shot. The bullet never came. The soldier collapsed, a familiar knife buried in his back. Nahimana emerged from the smoke, rushing to Mason's side. "You're hit," she said, examining the wound quickly. "Just a graze," he lied, the pain evident in his voice. "The others?" "Safe, heading for the rendezvous point." She helped him to his feet. "We need to move. Now." Colonel Walton, momentarily forgotten, lunged for his fallen pistol. Nahimana reacted instinctively, her foot connecting with his wrist in a sharp crack that sent the weapon skittering away. "Apache witch!" Walton spat, cradling his broken wrist. Nahimana met his gaze steadily. "Remember this day, Colonel. Remember that your prisoners walked free from your fort, despite all your power. Remember that a single Apache woman helped defeat you." She turned away, supporting Mason as they retreated into the thickening smoke. Behind them, Walton's shouts for assistance faded as the fire and chaos consumed more of the fort. Their exit route was cut off. Soldiers now guarded the waste gate, and the main gates were sealed. Mason's wound slowed their progress. Blood seeping through his makeshift bandage. "The north wall," he suggested, his voice weakening. "Construction was never completed properly. There's a section we might be able to climb." They made their way through the burning fort, dodging patrols and using the growing darkness to their advantage. The north wall loomed before them, its adobe. Surface rough and uneven, climbable but a significant challenge, especially for a wounded man. "You go first," Mason urged. "I'll follow," Nahimana shook her head. "Together, or not at all." Before Mason could argue, hoofbeats approached from behind. They turned to see Blackwood dismounting from his horse, rifle in hand, his face illuminated by the fire's glow. "End of the line," the bounty hunter announced, leveling his weapon at them. "I've lost too much today to let you walk away." Mason shifted, placing himself between Nahimana and the rifle. "Your quarrel is with me, Blackwood. Let her go." Blackwood's laugh was cold and mirthless. "Noble to the end, eh, Thorn? No, I think I'll take you both back to Walton. What's left of his fort, anyway." His finger tightened on the trigger. "Or perhaps I'll just collect the bounty on your heads and be done with it." The moment stretched, taut with lethal possibility. Then from the darkness beyond the wall, a rifle cracked. Blackwood jerked, a look of surprise crossing his face as he dropped to one knee, blood blossoming from his shoulder. A second shot followed, striking the ground at his feet, forcing him to roll aside for cover. "Go!" shouted a familiar voice from beyond the wall. "Climb, now!" Jeremiah Wade had joined the battle. The night air felt like freedom as Nahimana and Mason scrambled over the north wall of Fort Stanton. Wade's covering fire kept Blackwood pinned down, preventing pursuit as they dropped to the hard-packed earth on the other side. The fort behind them blazed against the night sky, orange flames reflected in the clouds of smoke that billowed upward. Wade emerged from the shadows, rifle still at the ready. "About time," he muttered, helping Mason to his feet. "Thought you might decide to stay for dinner." Despite the pain of his wound, Mason managed a grim smile. "Food's terrible anyway." "We need to move," Nahimana urged, scanning the darkness behind them. "Blackwood won't stay down long." Wade nodded, whistling softly. Two horses emerged from the brush, already saddled. "Your people made it to the ravine," he informed them, Kitchie's leading them toward Hawk's Ridge as planned. Mounting was agony for Mason, his wound reopening with the effort. Once seated, he swayed dangerously, kept in the saddle only by Nahimana's steadying hand. "He needs a doctor," she said to Wade. "He needs a miracle," Wade replied bluntly. "But I know a place closer than Hawk's Ridge. Old Trapper's cabin about 5 miles west. Defensible position with access to medicinal plants." Behind them, the sounds of organized pursuit began to emerge from the chaos of the burning fort. Shouts and orders carried on the night air as Walton rallied his remaining men. They rode hard through the darkness, following game trails and dry creek beds that only Wade seemed able to discern in the moonless night. Mason's condition deteriorated with each passing mile, his breathing becoming labored, body burning with fever. After what seemed an eternity, Wade led them into a narrow canyon, then up a nearly invisible path to a small plateau. The cabin materialized from the darkness, little more than a one-room structure of rough-hewn logs with a stone chimney, but to their exhausted eyes, it looked like salvation. "Get him inside," Wade directed, dismounting to secure the horses. In a small lean-to behind the cabin, Nahimana helped Mason from his horse, supporting most of his weight as they staggered through the doorway. Inside was simple, but surprisingly well-maintained. A bed against one wall, a stone fireplace, shelves stocked with supplies and medicines. "Another of your secret homes?" she asked Wade as he entered behind them. "One of several," he confirmed, lighting a lantern. "A man in my position needs options." They eased Mason onto the bed, his face ashen in the lamplight. Nahimana cut away his blood-soaked shirt, revealing a wound far worse than he had admitted. The bullet had torn through his side, leaving a jagged furrow that bled freely. Wade assessed the damage with a practiced eye. "Bullet grazed the liver, bad, but not necessarily fatal if we can stop the bleeding and prevent infection." Together they worked to clean and dress the wound. Nahimana recognized many of the herbs and tinctures Wade used, similar to her mother's remedies, though prepared differently. By the time they finished, Mason had fallen into an uneasy sleep, his breathing shallow but steady. "Will he survive?" Nahimana asked, washing Mason's blood from her hands in a basin of water. "If he makes it through the night," Wade replied, his usual gruffness tempered with genuine concern. "He's strong, and he has something to live for." He glanced at her meaningfully. "That matters more than most people realize." Nahimana moved to the cabin's single window, looking out at the star-filled sky. In the far distance, a faint orange glow marked the continuing fire at Fort Stanton. "My people will be wondering what happened to us. They're safe for now," Wade assured her. "Kitchi knows these mountains better than any of Walton's men. By dawn, they'll be deep in Apache territory where the army won't dare follow, not with the fort in ruins and half their men injured." "And Blackwood?" Wade's expression darkened. "A man like that doesn't give up easily. My shot wasn't fatal. Deliberate choice I'm beginning to regret." Nahimana studied him thoughtfully. "You could have killed him. Why didn't you?" "Complicated. History," Wade replied, his tone making it clear the subject was closed. Through the remainder of the night, they took turns tending to Mason and watching for pursuit. Wade shared what provisions he had: jerky, biscuits, and strong coffee that helped keep exhaustion at bay. As dawn approached, Mason's fever broke. His eyes opened clear and aware for the first time in hours. "Still alive, then," he murmured, attempting to sit up. "Barely," Nahimana admonished, gently pressing him back. "Don't undo our hard work." "The others?" "Safe," she assured him. "Thanks to you." A ghost of a smile touched Mason's lips before he drifted back to sleep, this time more peacefully. Wade, who had been watching from the doorway, nodded with satisfaction. "He'll make it. Tough bastard always was." The first rays of sunrise illuminated the plateau, bathing the weathered cabin in golden light. Nahimana stepped outside, breathing deeply of the crisp morning air. From this vantage point, she could see for miles, rolling forests, rugged canyons, and in the far distance, the sacred peaks where her people had sought refuge for generations. Wade joined her, offering a cup of coffee. "Your people will be at Hawk's Ridge by now," he said. "Safe, but facing an uncertain future. The army won't stop hunting them, especially after this." "We've survived worse," Nahimana replied. "We adapt. We endure." "There's another option," Wade said carefully. "North of here, beyond army jurisdiction, unclaimed territory where neither Walton nor Blackwood would follow. Good hunting, clean water, defensible positions." Nahimana glanced at him sharply. "You know of such a place?" "Mapped it myself years ago," Wade confirmed. "Too remote for settlers, too rugged for the army to bother with. Your people could disappear there, for a time at least." "Why would you share this knowledge?" Wade's weathered face revealed little. "Let's just say I'm balancing accounts for past mistakes." Before Nahimana could press further, the distant sound of hoofbeats reached them. A lone rider approached from the east, following their trail from the previous night. Wade raised his rifle, but Nahimana placed her hand on the barrel. "It's Kitchi," she said, recognizing the rider's silhouette against the morning sky. Minutes later, Kitchi dismounted before the cabin, his expression a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "I feared the worst when you didn't join us," he said, embracing Nahimana briefly. "Mason was wounded," she explained. "We couldn't make it to the rendezvous." "The others?" "Safe at Hawk's Ridge," Kitchi confirmed, "including your mother. They sent me to find you and to warn you. Blackwood survived. He's gathered what's left of his men and is tracking our people." Wade cursed softly. "Persistent devil." "There's more," Kitchi continued gravely. "A larger army detachment is due at Fort Stanton within days. Walton has sent riders to intercept them, demanding immediate pursuit of all escaped Apache." The implications were clear. Their victory had been significant but temporary. Soon a much larger force would scour these mountains, hunting the escaped prisoners. "We need to move our people further into the high country," Kitchi concluded, "at least until winter makes pursuit impossible." Nahimana exchanged glances with Wade. "Or we could go north," she suggested, "beyond army territory." Kitchi's brow furrowed. "North? There is nothing for our people there." "There is freedom," she countered, "a chance to live without constantly looking over our shoulders." Inside the cabin, Mason stirred, awakened by their voices. With effort, he pulled himself to a sitting position. "She's right," he called weakly. "North is your best chance." Kitchi studied them all with obvious suspicion. "And you would guide us there?" he asked Wade. "Out of kindness." "Out of pragmatism," Wade corrected. "What happens after Fort Stanton changes everything. The army won't rest until they make an example of your people, or what's left of Blackwoods. Men finds you first." A heavy silence fell as they contemplated the choice before them. To remain in their ancestral lands meant continuing a fight they could not ultimately win. To leave meant abandoning sacred ground, yet perhaps preserving their people's future. "It is not my decision alone," Kitchi said finally. "The elders must be consulted." Nahimana nodded, respecting the wisdom in his words. "We will present both paths and let our people choose their destiny." As the morning advanced, they prepared to depart. Mason carefully secured on a travois constructed by Wade, provisions packed for the journey to Hawk's Ridge. The future remains uncertain, but one truth stood undeniable. Through courage, sacrifice, and unexpected alliance, they had achieved what many would have thought impossible. Before mounting her horse, Nahimana paused beside Mason. "Why did you risk everything for people not your own?" she asked, a question that had lingered since their first encounter. Mason's eyes, though pained, held steady clarity. "Because boundaries drawn on maps don't determine the worth of human lives," he replied simply, "and because sometimes standing aside is a greater sin than standing between." As they rode away from the cabin, four unlikely allies bound by shared struggle, the mountains seemed to embrace them. Ahead lay Hawk's Ridge and a momentous decision for the Mescalero Apache. Behind them, the smoldering remains of Fort Stanton stood as testimony to the power of resistance and the unquenchable human thirst for freedom. The story of the Apache woman captured by bounty hunters and the lone settler who risked everything to free her would be told for generations, a reminder that even in the darkest times, courage and compassion could prevail against seemingly insurmountable odds. And sometimes, the most unlikely heroes emerged from the most unexpected places. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.